For over 20 years, the R.L. Drake Company built the amateur radio equipment that serious operators swore by. Their receivers set the standard. Their transceivers outsold the competition worldwide. The distinctive blue glow of a Drake dial became one of the most recognized symbols in ham radio. And before any of that, Drake's engineers built tank jammers used on the beaches of Normandy. But in the early 1970s, Drake made one engineering decision that opened the door for Japanese competitors to take everything. That mistake only makes sense once you understand how the company thought about engineering from the very beginning. Robert Lloyd Drake was born in Cincinnati in 1910, and he spent the years after college working through some of the best engineering departments in the country. He worked at the Dayton Radio Company, Bendix Aviation, and Lear Aviation under Bill Lear himself. The entire time, he was also an active amateur radio operator under the call sign Whiskey 8, Charlie Yankee Echo, which meant he was not just designing radios for a living. He went home and used them. That dual perspective convinced him he could build better filtering equipment than anything his employers were producing. So in 1943, he quit, rented space at 11 Longworth Street in Dayton, in a modest building where a coat hanger manufacturer worked the floor above, and he launched the R.L. Drake Company with a handful of employees. His timing turned out to be extraordinary. The Army Signal Corps needed electronic filters to combat enemy jamming during the Second World War, and that was exactly what Drake built. Between 1944 and 1945, his tiny company secured 3 military contracts worth a combined $377,000, producing very high-frequency monitors, mine detectors, and tank jamming equipment deployed on the beaches of Normandy. The U.S. military even came back and asked Drake if he could build a filter to counter his own jammer. He told them it was scientifically impossible based on his design methodology. He had built something he could not undo. When the war ended, so did the contracts. Drake had to take whatever work kept the doors open, building table lamps for Kresge, assembling spring contacts for General Electric, and winding coils for Delco. Unglamorous survival work. But through all of it, he kept producing one thing on his own terms: filters for the amateur radio market. That small product line quietly held the company together. And by 1953, it had grown enough to move the operation to the Baum Opera House in Miamisburg, Ohio. There, Drake started building accessories for the ham community: Q multipliers for national receivers, product detectors for Collins radio units and phone patches. Good products, but not the kind that change an industry. The product arrived in 1957. Single sideband transmission was emerging as a superior alternative to amplitude modulation, or AM for voice communications, but operators dismissed it as a passing trend. Every receiver on the market tried to handle both amplitude modulation and single sideband, and did neither well. Drake ignored that compromise entirely and built the 1A receiver from the ground up for single sideband and continuous wave reception only. The physical design was just as unconventional. In an era of wide, heavy boat anchor receivers, the 1A was tall, thin, and narrow, shaped like an American mailbox. Operators called it the black box. Roughly 1,100 units were built between 1957 and 1959, and almost overnight, Drake became a serious force in the market. That success forced another move, this time to 540 Richard Street in Miamisburg, which became Drake's manufacturing hub for decades. The early 1960s brought the 2A and 2B receivers, adding amplitude modulation reception back alongside the single sideband foundation. Then in 1963, the TR3 transceiver combined transmitting and receiving into a single chassis for the first time, and demand was enormous. Drake was now a global brand, but the real crown jewels arrived in 1965 with the Drake Twins, the R4 receiver, and the T4X transmitter. The permeability-tuned oscillator delivered dial resolution better than 1 kHz across all amateur bands. Passband tuning let operators electronically shift the filter response to eliminate interference without losing the signal they wanted. And then there was the look. Drake used incandescent bulbs behind greenish-blue filters for dial and meter illumination, and that glow became known as Drake Blue, as recognizable to ham operators as any logo. The 4 line evolved through A, B, and C versions over the next decade, each incorporating more solid-state components. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The C line, introduced in 1973, was still a vacuum tube design at its core. Drake had perfected mechanical tuning and high-precision filtering to such a degree that they saw no reason to abandon it. If they had reconsidered that approach, this would be a very different story. While Drake was refining tube-based designs, the ground was shifting beneath the entire industry. Yaesu, Kenwood, and ICOM were investing heavily in fully solid-state engineering and digital frequency synthesis, using production volume to drive costs down and offering features that pulled buyers away. The clearest example came in 1978. Drake was still marketing the TR-4CW, essentially a 15-year-old vacuum tube transceiver with only minor updates such as receiver incremental tuning. That same year, Yaesu released the FT901DM with digital displays, broadband solid-state amplifiers, and advanced logic control. Drake was at least 2 to 3 generations behind. In international markets, a complete Drake station cost more than double the price of a Japanese transceiver that offered more features. The same engineering philosophy that had made Drake dominant, building the best possible version of proven technology rather than chasing trends, was now the thing holding them back. Drake answered with the TR7 and R7, both fully solid-state with digital frequency readouts. The R7 in particular was considered a reference quality receiver with dynamic range performance that set the standard for years. On pure engineering merit, it proved Drake still had the talent. But the 7 line arrived in a market that Japanese firms already owned, with bigger marketing budgets, higher production volumes, and a price-to-performance ratio that a small factory in Ohio simply could not match. Being the best receiver on the shelf did not matter if most buyers had already chosen the shelf next to it. Robert Drake Sr. died in 1975, and his son Peter now led the company into a painful reality. The amateur radio market could no longer sustain the business. In 1981, Drake's engineers pivoted to home satellite television and built a working prototype receiver in just 4 months, a timeline that would have been ambitious for a company 10 times its size. Throughout the 1980s, Drake became a major player in satellite hardware, producing receivers and motorized dish positioning systems distributed across the United States and Europe. Models like the ESR-24 and the later ESR-4240E earned a reputation for the same build quality that had defined the radio line. Then in 1984, amateur radio production officially stopped. Drake cited a strong US dollar, a lack of FCC deregulation, and foreign competition that had become impossible to overcome. The one exception was the shortwave listening line, which produced the R8 general coverage receiver in 1991. Reviewers called it one of the finest consumer shortwave receivers ever made. The R8B stayed in production until 2005, the last chapter of Drake's radio story. After that, the company shifted entirely to professional cable television equipment. producing digital encoders and signal distribution hardware under the Drake and Dracom brands. In 2012, Blonder Tongue Laboratories acquired Drake for $6.5 million, at a time when the company was still generating roughly $10 million a year in revenue. For a while, the acquisition looked like a reasonable consolidation of two legacy names in American television infrastructure. But Blonder Tongue itself eventually buckled under structural changes in the broadband market and supply chain disruptions, filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November 2025. On December 24, 2025, all assets, including the Drake brand and intellectual property, were sold to a new entity for $2.95 million. A company that built jamming equipment for the Normandy invasion, that changed how the world communicated with the single sideband-only 1A, that gave an entire generation of operators the blue glow of a Drake dial, was sold for less than the price of a modest house. The hundreds of thousands of Drake receivers and transceivers still in active use by collectors around the world are the real legacy. The engineering outlasted the company. It usually does.